Hey, what's going on YouTube? I'm DarkJack, and in this video I'll go flawless in the map Overflow in Black Ops 2. And today what I want to talk about is, why do people play bad video games? Because with all the great video games that are out there, why do people play games that suck? And when I say games that suck, I'm not talking about people having a different taste or different genres that they enjoy. I'm talking about games that are almost universally regarded as being bad. And let me give you some examples. Aliens Colonial Marines, which was released by Gearbox, though actually Timegate actually developed most of the campaign. It sold 1.3 million new copies, but it got a 43 on Metacritic. So how does a game sell so well when it is reviewed so poorly? And if you don't know the backstory behind that game, Gearbox was supposed to develop the game, and Sega was the publisher. But Gearbox used the money instead to make Borderlands, and they outsourced the development of it to Timegate. And all Gearbox was concerned about was game-ending or game-breaking bugs. So over 1 million people bought that game new for $60, but it still did very poorly review-wise, and the game had lots of bugs. Another example would be Duke Nukem Forever, which are the same initials as DNF, or Did Not Finish, which I think is what most of the people who bought it did. They didn't finish it, and they rushed it back to the store. It sold over 350,000 new copies, and it got a 54 on Metacritic. Another example could be The Walking Dead Survival Instinct, not the Telltale game, which was actually good, but the first-person shooter Walking Dead game that got a 39 on Metacritic. Another one is The Army of Two, The Devil's Cartel, which got a 54 on Metacritic, and it came out the same day as BioShock Infinite, March 26th, and BioShock Infinite was one of the highest rated games ever, with a 94 on Metacritic. And I cannot imagine what EA was thinking. They're the publishers of the Army of Two. So I cannot believe that they released the game the same day as BioShock Infinite. And I could imagine someone standing in the line at GameStop waiting to pick up a copy of the Army of Two, The Devil's Cartel. And they're the only person in line going to buy the game instead of BioShock Infinite. And so who in the right mind would do that? And I can imagine the expression of the GameStop employee behind the counter when the person walks up and says, "Hi, I'd like to pick up my copy of The Army of Two, The Devil's Cartel," instead of BioShock Infinite, and everyone in line laughs at them. And Total Biscuit, who is a YouTube commentator, said in one of his videos where he was talking about whether or not you should pre-order games, and he argued that you should not because you are encouraging a bad business practice. And he said in that video, when someone buys a bad video game, there are two kinds of people in that regards. There are some people who admit that they made a mistake, while there are others who go full Stockholm Syndrome, and use the example of the game The War Z, which is a ripoff of DayZ, and The War Z is filled with lots of bugs, and it's essentially unplayable on PC. And that got me thinking, what does Stockholm Syndrome have to do with bad video games? Because Stockholm Syndrome, it's a syndrome, it has a real-life example of a bank robbery that took place at a bank in Stockholm, Sweden. And one of the people who was robbing the bank was someone who was kidnapped, and they eventually became sympathetic to the organization that kidnapped them as a defense mechanism. And so, does Stockholm Syndrome exist in video games? I think the answer is yes. I think some people, when they buy a game that is bad, they don't want to admit that they made a mistake and that they made a poor decision. Instead, they have to keep playing the game in order to justify to themselves that they've made a good investment, rather than considering that game to be a sunk cost. And what a sunk cost is that something that you recognized that you've wasted money on, and so it's no longer worth your time and effort to continue to invest time and money into it. And so instead of considering it a sunk cost, they instead continue to play it and to buy the DLC in order to try to convince themselves that they made a good purchase. I think that's part of the reason why people play bad video games, is because they don't want to admit that they made a bad decision. And a very large portion of bad video games are licensed games, which means that they are based off of a TV show or a movie, and what they're doing is they're taking advantage of their fan base. And people who are fans of TV shows usually are not very good video game critics, in my opinion, based on all the people that buy licensed games that are based off of a TV show or a movie that are usually really bad, because those games are rushed to production to coincide with a movie. And examples could be the Avatar video game. Not the movie that was great, but the video game was very poor. The Men in Black video game that was published by Activision was a third-person on-rails shooter that was pretty terrible. And then the new Star Trek game as well. Not the Star Trek movie, but the Star Trek game that was filled with glitches, and they got really negative review scores. But lots of people are still going to buy it because they are hardcore Star Trek fans. And so those types of games are taking advantage of their fan base. They are exploiting the intellectual property for the sake of a game. And so do people who buy bad video games simply have poor taste, or are there really that many people out there? Do that many people really have that poor of a taste for games? And generally I find that children's games tend to be of much poorer quality than games that are for a mature audience. That's why mature rated games seem to sell a lot better. Because children tend to have a very poor taste in video games because they don't have as much experience playing video games as older gamers. So older gamers tend to know better than younger ones. That's why a lot of games that are made for kids are very poorly made, and the graphics are pretty poor generally because little kids don't care about graphics at all. And so when people go to the store to buy a video game and they have no idea what to look for, do they make their decision based off of the box art, based off of the text blurbs on the back of the cover? And so what do you think? Why do you think people spend money on bad games when there's so many other great games out there? And I think that most of it has to do with the fact that so many people who buy games are uninformed. They don't pay attention to review scores. They don't watch the raw gameplay footage on YouTube. And they're not familiar with the history of a series or who is developing it and who's behind the game. Because you can find out a lot about a game just by looking at the history of it and finding out who is behind it. And that may be part of the reason why Aliens, Colonial Marines, and Duke Nukem Forever sold so well. Is because those games, or at least Aliens, Colonial Marines, Duke Nukem Forever did not. But both games are really hyped. It's because both of them were published by Gearbox. And because Gearbox was responsible for Borderlands and Borderlands 2, games that were considered to be really good, people bought those games based off of that. But the thing you have to remember is that the only game Gearbox actually cares about is Borderlands. So the only Borderlands or Gearbox games you should actually buy is Borderlands. That's the only franchise Gearbox cares about. So that's a pro tip for you. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys later.